Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today's session is going to be a session on PPP. What we'll do is we'll find out what this stands for, you'll find out how to apply it in your classes, and we'll go through lots of different things that I'm sure you're going to need in your upcoming lessons. This session will cover about lots of things. Example, creating effective aims, lesson staging and scaffolding, how you can start with the end in mind, present, practice, and produce. We'll look at each of these terms individually so we can explore them in a little bit more detail. About classroom management, communicated language teaching, student centering, and finally a wrap up. So when we talk about PPP, there are four really important terms outside of PPP. And those are creating effective aims, classroom management, communicative language teaching, and student centering. Part of mastering PPP is also about mastering these four concepts, because if you can get these four concepts mastered, these are the four cornerstones of how to apply PPP effectively in your classes. So what are we waiting for? Let's learn all about it. Okay, first of all, creating effective aims. This has to be a starting point, because if you don't have effective aims, you don't really know where you're going to go. And if you don't know where you're going to go or what you're trying to achieve, well, the lesson is going to be pointless, aimless. There's no destination, there's no direction for it. So when we talk about aims, often we talk about them as expected outcomes. Why do we use the term expected outcome? Because it's the outcome that we expect from the class. It's what we expect students to be able to do, what we expect by the end of the class. Obviously, lessons don't always happen the way that we think they're going to happen, the way that we want them to happen. And sometimes things have to change and we have to adapt with our students. That's why we call them expected outcomes as opposed to aims. Secondly, is not all aims are good aims. So for example, if they are too general or not focused, then they become unachievable. And sometimes I see it where teachers have aims such as, I want students to understand the target vocabulary. Well, those are not good aims, because what does understand really mean? How do we measure it? How do we measure whether students have been able to, whether they've been able to recognize it, whether they've been able to remember it, whether they've been able to produce it? It's not clear what we want to be able to achieve or what we want students to do by the end of the class. If you look here, I've given an ineffective example of an ineffective aim is teach students 10 vocabulary words. Well, this is what the teacher intends to do, not what we want the students to do. So this is not an effective aim. Next is, well, how do we measure it? We might say, did the teacher teach 10 vocabulary words? Well, yes, they did. Does it mean it was a successful aim? Well, no, because it doesn't tell us what the students learned. And then another thing is, what does teach mean? Does teach mean that we want students to recognize the words, we want students to remember the words, we want students to use the words in a sentence, ask and answer the use of vocabulary? It's not clear what it is we're trying to do. So when we go into our lesson, it's not going to be an effective lesson. A better aim would be something like, students can use the 10 vocabulary items to ask and answer questions. This is better because by the end of the lesson, we can measure, can students use these vocabulary items to ask and answer a question? Yes or no. So we can answer very, very clearly, did we achieve our aim? Yes or no. Or students can recognize and remember 10 vocabulary items. Well, this is a better aim because we can measure it. We can tell whether the students have been able to do it or not. We can set up a final productive activity which shows us exactly how many students have remembered and exactly how many words they have remembered. Effective. Another example of teach students listening and reading skills. So this is another example of a bad aim, because we'll teach students reading and listening skills. Well, reading has so many different skills, listening has so many different skills. Well, which skills do we want to teach? How are we going to measure it? How do we know if we have succeeded in our aim or we have not succeeded in that aim? So this is not a good aim because I don't know how I'm going to measure it. It's not clear what students have to do by the end of the lesson. So just to summarize this in one sentence, that your aim has to be something which is measurable and something which students are going to achieve. Then it's a good aim. Okay, so now we've looked at how to create good aims for a lesson. We'll look at how to put a lesson together. So when planning a lesson, you have to realize that you can't just go from number 1 straight to number 8, 9, 10 without overloading them with too much information. It's too much. It's too fast to go straight from introducing something to asking them to produce it. And remember, we can't expect students to produce something we haven't taught them yet. If when we go in, the students are currently at number 6, well, we shouldn't jump down to number 1. If when we go in and we recognize that students know a lot already, then we shouldn't take it down to the simplest thing, but we should be asking, how can we take them up to number 7? How can we take them to number 8? If we go in and our students are only at number 1, well, we have to be asking, how can we improve them up to number 2, number 3, number 4? It doesn't mean that we're going to try and pull them all the way up to number 8, number 9. We have to be realistic with what our aims are. So what this is called is staging. What staging means is the way that we organize our lesson from the easiest thing to then the most challenging thing, or another way of looking at it is organizing it from the most controlled activity to the least controlled activity, or another way is organizing it from receptive down to productive. But a key theme here is that the lesson, we can't be asking them to produce something we haven't taught them, and we have to be giving them input before the output comes out. We have to make sure that we are giving them time to practice something before we ask them to produce something. That's why PPP is present, practice, produce, and not the other way around. Another key term is called scaffolding. So the support that we provide to students is called scaffolding. Why is it called scaffolding? Because scaffolding is the construction that we put up around a building when we're slowly building it bit by bit by bit by bit. We're not trying to build a house in just one day, but it involves the scaffolding slowly moving up. And this is what it is. What we do is that we give students scaffolding, and that's giving them support in order to help them to be able to get to that final productive task. Give you an example of expected outcome of students can remember how to ask and answer the questions using the target vocabulary. Well, what we need to do is that we need to make sure we're putting the lesson in an order which allows that. We need to make sure that they are given input about the vocabulary. We need to make sure that they are given input about the questions. We need to make sure that they are given practice to ask and answer the questions. And then finally, we have some sort of productive task where they're able to ask and answer the questions in a freer context. And then we can measure how well our students have been able to accomplish the aim. So, what do we do? So we've thought about aims, we've thought about scaffolding and staging. Next is we start with the end in mind. This is something called backwards planning. With backwards planning, we start with a final activity, the activity which will demonstrate whether or not students have understood and have been able to produce the lesson's aim, usually the productive activity. After we have this, we will then ask the question of, okay, what do students need to know to be able to achieve this? The next step is to reorder in a logical way from the easiest task to the most complex, and make sure that the language needed for the productive task in the later stage has been covered in both the input and the practice. What this means is you need to give them the language you expect them to produce. You need to give them the time to practice this language you expect them to produce. To go give you another example, an example of that, we want a student to do a role play about going to a cafe. Well, what we need to do is we need to make sure they have the vocabulary about the cafe. We need to make sure that they have questions about that they're going to ask at the cafe. We need to make sure that they have a clear context and example of what does a role play look like. We need to make sure that they have practice asking and answering those questions. And then finally, we need to make sure that they have an opportunity to do that productive task, to actually do a role play in a cafe type context. And this way of planning makes it very easy to plan lessons, because all you need is that final productive task, which is going to measure your aim. So if you have a clear aim and a clear productive task, well, the rest of the lesson is really quite easy to plan because it's just filling in the gaps, making sure that the students are being given everything that they need to have in order to produce that productive activity that this is backwards playing. And then if you can do this, you'll make sure that everything in your lesson is really focused on achieving that aim, and everything in this lesson is really focused on getting to that productive activity and having students to produce in your class. Okay, so we've spoken about aims, we've spoken about staging, we've spoken about planning and supporting your students. Now let's talk about the different P's. So present, practice, and produce. First, we have present. So when we present, it doesn't mean we're not just giving students new information in a very passive way. It's not just the teacher speaking and the students repeating, but what we need to be doing is setting up the context. Anytime that we learn language, we always have a context. So we shouldn't just be going into class and be like, hey guys, here is the new vocabulary for today. We need to set up a context. We need to help students understand about where this vocabulary lives. If we're teaching them animals that live in the jungle, well, we need to set up the context of a jungle before we introduce the animals. If we're teaching them about jobs, well, we need to have a picture about lots of different jobs so they can understand that these are jobs and these are people that are going to work. This should also involve a two-way experience. So presenting, it's going to come from a teacher, but the teacher should be engaging students with lots of questions along the way. So we can ask some questions of, for example, like, okay, if it's a doctor, then we can ask them very, very easy questions like, okay, does a doctor work in a hospital or does he work in a school? Okay, does the doctor help people or animals? And all of these questions can better help students to understand the vocabulary, and it can make them more proactive participants in the lesson as opposed to just sitting passively and waiting for the lesson to come to them. Another thing you can ask during this part are CCQs, concept checking questions, and ICQs, instruction checking questions. CCQs are very much like the ones that I mentioned earlier, is that you can ask them questions to make sure they're understanding the vocabulary. So if you're teaching about the concept of being late, you can ask a question of, well, if school starts at 8 a.m. and you arrive at 8:05, are you early or late? And this is a way of students answering, and it's a good way of you as a teacher seeing very physically about which students understand and which students do not understand. ICQs are a way of checking that students have understood your instructions. For example, you can ask them questions such as, okay, will you work by yourself or work in pairs? Work as a group. When you are finished, do you close your book or do you raise your hands? These are ways where it's basically just repeating your instructions, but you're asking a question, so students have to be more proactive participants. Next is the practice stage. So I've spoken about this a little bit already in this session so far, is that practice usually goes from controlled to less controlled to free. What does control practice mean? Well, control practice means that the teacher has lots of control and the students don't have much choice about the language. For example, think about the activity about rearranging a sentence. Well, we are giving the students all of the language that they need. They just have to put it in the correct order. This is very, very controlled. Think about another example of a gap fill activity. In a gap fill activity, we are giving them a whole sentence. They just need to provide one word. So they don't have to do very much. We are controlling a lot of it. Think about another activity like we are asking them open questions. Well, that's less controlled because the students have more choice about the language that they have to use to answer the question. So that's why our lesson usually goes from controlled to less controlled to freer. So in order for us to supply the support that students need in order to be able to get to that freer practice. So the key thing about practice is it's accuracy focused, and it's focused on making sure that students have practice with the language before they move to the less controlled or the freer stages or the productive stages. So produce, the productive stage. This is where we get students using the language as naturally as possible. For example, role plays, presentations, discussions, communicative tasks. It doesn't mean it's totally free. The students can talk about anything that they want, The teacher will still give them a focus, but it just means that the students will have more choice about the language they use. Ideally, what we want to do is set up a situation which requires the target language. So for example, if you're talking about the past, talking about something you did at the weekend, something you did last week, that's a good situation to talk about it because you need to use the past tense to talk about that topic. And the productive task is very, very important because as we looked at in earlier parts of this session is that it will measure whether or not the students have actually achieved the aim of the lesson or not. So it's really important. Many people don't get to the productive stage, and this is a problem. If we're not having our students practice using real language, then they're never going to get good at using real language. And if students never get good at using real language, well, they're not going to be able to achieve the things that we want them to achieve. Next, about classroom management. We have a separate training session on this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I want to ask the question, if a student misbehaves, is this the teacher's responsibility or is this the student's duty? Well, in this training session, I'm going to argue that it's the teacher's responsibility because it's their responsibility to create motivating lessons which are at the right level, not too easy, not too difficult. You all hear people talk about, you always hear teachers talk about classes that are so difficult, unmotivated, don't want to learn. Well, I'm going to argue that it's a teacher's responsibility to provide fun lessons which motivate students. All students are motivated by something. If you're finding you're having problems, try asking the following questions. Is your class boring? Do your students have to sit and listen to your lesson without much opportunity to engage? Is there lots of downtime? Do students have a discussion about a topic without any supporting language or supporting vocabulary? Well, all of this comes down to classroom management. If your class is too difficult, students will turn off. If the students are not engaged, students will turn off. If students don't have an opportunity to participate, students will turn off. If students are just sitting and listening passively, students will turn off. If students are engaged in a fun and motivating way, you've got them. That's when they're going to really, really focus. So the key thing out here I want to share about class management is ask yourself questions about what am I doing? How could I do something differently? And that will put you on the road to success. Communicative language teaching. What this means is creating real opportunities for our students to have real opportunities at communication. For example, if you have two students reading a dialogue from a book, this is not a communicative activity because no communication is going on. They're just reading. They're not really using their brains. Whereas if you take that same dialogue and have students change a few words to be true for them, well, that's communication because it's real communication. I don't know what you're going to say. You don't know what I'm going to say. We have to listen to each other. And that's simple. That's simple as it is. We need to try and make sure that we have opportunities for our students to communicate as often as possible because the more they practice real communication, the better they get at it. It's that simple. Another important concept we've been talking about a lot is student centering and how to get students as being more active participants. If we want a generation of proactive, productive students, you've got to start with small steps in your lessons. For example, instead of starting your lesson presenting new vocabulary, why not try and elicit it? Instead of telling them, okay, this is what we're going to study today, show them a picture and see what words they already know. Instead of asking a whole question, one or two questions, you could have them working in pairs to answer those questions. What we need to do is think about all of the small choices we can make during the learning process and always be asking ourselves the question, could students be more involved? Is there anything that I have done which students could be doing instead? How many students are actually participating at each stage in my lesson? Look at the last game you played. How many teams did you have? How long did each student have to wait to take their turn in that game? Could you reduce that amount of time? Could you make it so the students had more time to participate, less time to wait? Well, this is all about student centered. If you can ask yourself these questions, you can move forward to being better at student centered. Now I'm going to ask you some questions. These questions will also be on the LMS or on the handout, but these questions are just for you to think about to review all of the content we've covered so far. Is my aim clear? Is it clear what I want to achieve and what my students need to be able to do by the end of this lesson? What is my final activity? Does it measure the level to which I achieve my aim? If not, how can I measure whether I achieve my aim or not? Is my final productive activity communicative? Does my lesson have any elements where students are actually communicating? Does every activity have a purpose? Don't just do exercises or activities because they're in the book. Each activity you do needs a clear reason for it being part of your lesson. Is my lesson organized from control practice to freer practice? Does my control practice give students enough practice to be able to complete the productive task? How are my students engaged during the presentation part of my class? How do I make the content come alive and become interesting? How is my practice stage helping to improve the student's accuracy? How real is the productive stage? Does it imitate a real life situation? Is my lesson interesting for students? Do I have activities and games? Do my students have enough opportunities to be engaged with the lesson? Are they busy or are they engaged? Do I have a classroom management system? Is it clear, consistently used, fair and positive? Do any of my activities have an information gap? If no, is there any way one could be created? How student-centered is my lesson? Are activities done as a whole class, or could they be done as groups instead? With these checklist of questions, I guarantee you won't be missing anything. If you can answer all of these questions, then you have a great lesson. I promise you that. And that's it. This one has been quite a long one, and you may have to rewatch this video multiple times to get it. And it's also just an introduction to PPP. It's not everything you need to know. And with this introduction, we've covered lots of key concepts, but please watch this video as many times as you need to, and check the LMS where you'll have extra information, extra questions to think about, and good luck as your journey starts here. Start applying it today and give us feedback if you have any feedback about this training session. And please ask your supervisor if you need any extra support in your lessons. I'll see you in the next one.